Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Emily Silva. I'm the former NECAN coordinator, filling in today for Austin. Welcome to the 2023 NECAN webinar series. This is the 11th webinar in this series on monitoring priorities for the Northeast. And today we'll be focusing on Indigenous interests, concerns, and perspectives. With this series and the assistance of our presenters, the NECAN Steering Committee is working on the development of a regional monitoring plan for OA, and these webinars will serve as an informational resource for them as that plan comes together. At the conclusion of the presentation today, the Steering Committee will be asking the panel some questions, and then we'll open up to a more general Q&A following that. So feel free to use the raise hand function on the bottom of your screen, or you can just put something in the chat and the moderator will get to your questions. So first, we're going to be hearing from Sharri Venno. Sharri is the Houlton Band of Maliseet Indians environmental planner. She has a bachelor's in biology and master's in wildlife conservation. Sharri was hired in 1993 to develop the band's environmental program and advance ecosystem restoration in the Maliseet sub-basin. Sharri has many years of experience in program development, grants management, and general coordination of HBMI engagement in environmental projects and activities. To reach its overarching goals of salmon spawning in tribal waters and eagles nesting in tribal land, HBMI and Sharri develop watershed partnerships and collaboratively problem solve to achieve common interests. And so I'll hand things over to you, Sharri. You can share your screen now.
Righty. So I don't see myself on the screen. Do you guys see me?
We can see you. Yep.
Okay. I don't mind not seeing myself, but I thought maybe there was a problem. All right, so here. So can you see my first slide, Maliseet and ocean acidification?
Yes, we can see that. It's not in presenter mode, but we can see that slide.
Okay, yeah, I'm not, I've tried to figure out how to do it in presenter mode, but it's not having any success. So I guess I'll just go through it as is. So thanks for that introduction, Emily. You may notice that in that paragraph bio of my background and experience, none of my qualifications include fisheries biologist. So I just want to put that out there, that I am talking about things that I don't know a lot about. And so I am being very general about our concerns, can't really talk in specifics. And I hope to learn more as the conversation progresses. But I wanted to highlight the statement to reach our overarching goals of salmon spawning and eagles nesting. We develop watershed partnerships. So, and I've come up with this is an old logo slide. I think there are a number of additions we could put on this slide of partners, but we've kind of run out of space. But that is how we look at our path to success of reaching those goals, because they're so large and they're such at the scale of that effort in terms of how far reaching it is in geography. Makes our efforts locally, I mean, we can contribute, but we can't achieve our goals independently. So I wanted to give everyone kind of a geography lesson, as it were. I'm not going to talk a lot about the tribe, just about our goals and our space. If we are, I hope you can tell, a very small tribe. We've got the watershed that we are located in, up in the right-hand corner, that is the Medux-Niqueg watershed. You can see from the larger St. John Holistic watershed map where we're located in Maine and New Brunswick. We are a transboundary watershed. It's the watershed where we reside, where trust lands are, the majority of tribal trust lands are located. And we are on the Medux-Niqueg River itself, close to the Canadian border, close to the mouth of the watershed, although the larger northern part of the watershed is empties north of us. We still have interests up there. We have land-based interests up there as well. I took the photograph of our Medux-Niqueg River yesterday. It was gorgeous day. So I'm very pleased with the photograph. And in fact, we spent many years trying to make it look like this. We worked a lot of water quality and fish habitat. A lot of the riffles you will see are because we did in-stream restoration on that stretch of the main stem of the Medux-Niqueg. This is looking upstream from a bridge which connects the Medux-Niqueg, or tribal lands within the Medux-Niqueg on both sides, the east side and the west side of the river. But it still has a long way to go. Water quality is still degraded by the land use in the area, which is basically farmland, growing potatoes. There's a lot of open farmland that doesn't, where the soil is exposed a lot of the time. Although that's improving. But it is a fragmented system. There's a lot of legacy impacts from logging, farming, dams. Most of the dams have been removed. And so we spent many years working on this watershed, this place where the Houlton Band and Maliseet Indians are in. And it's a very place-based culture, as you can see by the name the tribe calls itself, and that's the people of the Medux-Niqueg. So let me draw your attention again to the larger watershed within which the Medux-Niqueg is located. We are part of a larger Maliseet nation, 7 communities of seven tribal nations or First Nation governments are in New Brunswick and Quebec. The Maliseet nation at large calls itself Wolastoqey. So they are people of the Holistic or St. John, Holistic St. John, I like to call it. So you can see we are pretty far removed from the outfall of our watershed, our larger Medux-Niqueg, our larger Holistic St. John River, and have a very few ways of affecting how the larger watershed is managed downstream, particularly when it comes to fish passage and water quality and habitat as well. But it has given us a pretty big perspective, pretty broad perspective of what it will take to see salmon back in our system. And it's going to take a lot. But because we have this sort of larger perspective, because we're not just looking at our little watershed, because we have this big goal of salmon restoration, we have looked far afield at what is affecting salmon. What is it that's what is it that we can do to improve our chances of restoring salmon in the Medux-Niqueg? And so a lot of that means looking at the folks that are working within that watershed and beyond. And so I think we'll take that to, I hope, where we can talk about ocean acidification and start talking about ocean acidification and how that fits into our thinking and our broader perspective. So
I mean, that's a lot.
Is that a comment on the map? So you can see where we are in sort of at a large, even larger scale. St. John is believe it or not, the holistic St. John is the longest watershed on the East Coast. I don't think it's the largest, but it is the longest. And it is part of the larger Gulf of Maine watershed. And that's where our extended thinking has brought us to, that we need to understand how the health of the entire Gulf of Maine watershed and the Atlantic Ocean, the North Atlantic. Because as we've reached out beyond ourselves, beyond our little watershed, to our larger holistic St. John watershed, to the even larger Gulf of Maine watershed, we see that it's all important. It all is significant. It all has the potential of supporting or preventing us from destroying salmon in the Maliseet. So we are thinking about, coastal waters, the Gulf of Maine, the Atlantic Ocean, and talking to. So I'm a member of the Gulf of Maine Council. I spent time on the oceans planning process, the RPB. Just recently rejoined NROC, and I guess Northeast Regional Oceans Council or committee, I'm not even sure. So we try to connect to all these groups that have an influence and an effect on the health of this larger watershed and its connection to the Gulf of Maine and the North Atlantic, and certainly salmon. That salmon that's so precious to us that we want to restore is affected by the health of everything in that. And so we are concerned about oceans acidification, or I know coastal acidification has been sort of a subset of that concern. We're certainly concerned about the area as all the climate impacts, including ocean acidification or coastal acidification on salmon, on the migratory fish that sort of integrate all these systems, that pass through all these systems and are affected by and affect all these systems. And how does ocean acidification or coastal acidification affect that migration, affect those species, how they interact, and how the ecosystems, the various ecosystems within that larger area are affected, that affect these migratory fish, just all the entire ecology, how everything that's going on is going to influence our success for one way or the other. And I guess I did want to say something about watersheds and acidification. I have heard that, particularly in the larger systems, rivers contribute to acidification in the coastal waters. I'd like to learn more about that. It's simply because we have a large system, an exceptionally large system. How is that influencing acidification in the outfall of the holistic St. John? How is that affecting success in that particular watershed of migratory fish and salmon in particular? And I think I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Sharri. I think it's on me now to pick it up from Emily to kind of moderate this discussion, which we have a small enough group, so I think we can try to keep it pretty interactive and informal. I want to first just say a big thank you for making the time to join us today and share your insights. I think this is a particularly unique perspective, not only as one that's kind of coming from an Indigenous community, but given that it's one that's going to so high up in the watershed, and so is really making sort of a longer distance connection, I think, than we often make. And I like to poke that a bit. But I also wanted to say thanks because, I think the fact that we're still hoping Ralph or Alexa might appear, but we are also very acutely aware from, hearing from a number of Indigenous partners that I think it's a good thing that there's a lot of attention at the moment to Indigenous communities and their interests and trying to sort of empower and engage them. And that also puts a lot of strain and a lot of demands on time and conflicts. And so I know other Indigenous groups we work with have made that very clear to us. I suspect that may be what Ralph and Alexa are facing, and I have no doubt you face it as well. So I'm grateful to you for making the time. So I've put down a number of questions here, but I'm going to hold off. The first thing I'd like to actually do is turn it over to one of the other more OA experts on the call to answer your question. The question about I'm not the best one to answer it. I could take a stab and it would be a mess. So we'll try to have someone else. And I'm not going to volunteer anyone unless no one steps up, but to just kind of talk Sharri through this connection between riverine outflow and coastal and ocean acidification. Then we'll make her answer questions for the next hour. So anybody game to take a stab at that one?
I can is Chris here too? I don't see, I'm not looking at everybody, but Chris would also be someone good, I think, to have weigh in on this. So I can start and then maybe Chris can add. Hi, I'm Samantha. I'm a co-chair of NECAN and I'm a professor here at UConn. I work on regional simulations, but because of that, I think a lot about integrating all sorts of different data sets and questions about like regional impacts of things and attribution. And in this case, freshwater especially in this area, so it depends on the bedrock and what the chemistry of the rocks are, or the geochemistry is. But in this area, the waters that are coming from the watershed tend to have a little bit, their chemistry is different. And so one factor called alkalinity is particularly low. And what that does is it changes the amount of carbon that can be held inside the river water. And it encourages, and as a result of that low value for alkalinity, it results in making regions more susceptible to like what we would call stressful conditions or undersaturated conditions for organisms that make their shells out of calcium carbonate, So that would be like various bivalves and other organisms has been shown to be sensitive to that as well, right? One of them, which I'm not sure if this has been shown to be the case in this area, but in Alaska, it's been shown that one of the main food sources for salmon is zooplankton called a pteropod, and we know that pteropods also live in Maine, and they are also sensitive to that threshold value that allows it to be energetically favorable for them to make their shells out of that material. And so that's referred to as a saturation state. Sometimes you'll see it as a symbol as omega. And in this region, freshwater tends to push that lower and make it more stressful or require more energy for them to maintain that shell. Okay, so that's one aspect of it, but rivers contribute in other ways too. One is by delivering nutrients, as you probably have heard a lot about and know, and nutrients can, when they're in excess, can cause a massive bloom, which would or a bloom that's in excess of what would have been there without those excess nutrients, eutrophication, right? And that can lead to a lot of organic material rotting in place and releasing CO2, and so exacerbating that ocean acidification. And this is often looped in with coastal acidification. Okay, so that can be patchy and something that happens localized, more localized, and is definitely an issue in the region, close to, especially in the near shore, sort of closer to the coastal zones. And then Chris, are there other aspects? I think there's probably one more that I'd love for you to weigh in on if you wanted to.
you want to give me a hint which one you were thinking
Oh,
of?
I was thinking about organic alkalinity, but I don't know if we want to go there.
Yeah, well, I can go there a little bit. So I'm looking at the map that you have on your screen right now, and just sort of coincidentally, I'm sorry, I'm Chris Hunt. I'm at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm on the NECAN Steering Committee. So we've done a few studies where we've sampled rivers and some estuaries up and down the Gulf of Maine. And actually we had a project that we're wrapping up now where we went up to the St. John and sampled at the mouth of the St. John for several, I think we did 8 trips up there. The St. John is interesting because there's a bunch of limestone in the watershed. So you actually have relatively higher alkalinity coming out of the St. John than you do in some of the other rivers in Maine and the rest of New England. So it's kind of a unique watershed in that way. But the St. John has really unique like hydrologic characteristics at the mouth. As you well know, you have the reversing falls at the mouth, and the estuary can either be out in the Bay of Fundy, or it can be like miles and miles and miles up the river, depending on how the flow is going. But I think Sam did a really nice job of summing up why we consider sort of river water to be an acidifying condition. So you can picture if you're a clam or somebody who's sitting along the coast, and there's, sort of like this year, if there's a lot of precipitation, really elevated river discharge, you get this plume of river water and kind of low salinity water along the coast. And the pH associated with that is lower than typical seawater. And so in general, we kind of associate river water with more acidic, lower pH conditions. That's not always the case. There are some examples of the opposite, like the Mississippi River is kind of a classic example of a river that has really, really high alkalinity and high pH, higher than the seawater that it flows into. That's mostly been associated with kind of agricultural practices and like liming, agricultural areas. But that's pretty atypical. And it's definitely atypical for here in the Gulf of Maine. So most rivers are pretty poorly buffered here in the Gulf of Maine compared to something like the Mississippi. One more thing I'll throw in there, though, is that this paradigm is changing a little bit. So there's sort of increasing evidence that alkalinity and associated with that, the pH of river water in kind of the Northeast and in New England is going up over time. And I've seen some people theorize that that's due to sort of recovery from atmospheric acid deposition. So, back in the bad old days, the emissions from whatever Midwestern power plants or other facilities like that would sort of rain down acid rain, right? Acid deposition. And that kind of leached out. And we were kind of like the tailpipe, right? So here in New England, we were kind of on the receiving end of a lot of that. And so over time, our soils were kind of leached out of a lot of their alkalinity and a lot of those cations that provide that buffering capacity. And that's kind of recovering over time as emissions standards have tightened. So there's kind of some good news in there. The alkalinity seems to be going up slowly, but going up over time within river waters. So does that kind of get at what you were wondering about?
Yes, thank you very much. That's helpful. So I guess the connecting, I sort of have a bit of understanding about the chemistry, and so then the next sort of, I guess, piece I need to understand is how is that chemistry affecting community and the community that within which migratory fish and particularly salmon
so
exist.
Then you're in good company here, because there's been lots and lots of discussions among this group and other groups about understanding the connections between chemical conditions and biological responses. And there's some work on that, but there's a ton more work to do, right? And so you noted salmon, right? So salmon always swim upstream to spawn, right? And so one would think that if they were particularly sensitive to pH, upstream is not where they would want to go because that's going in the wrong pH direction. So there's obviously like a really complex interplay between chemistry and particular species that we're just starting to try to understand.
Sure, and I have heard that, and the idea, you know, since salmon and other migratory fish exist in many different spaces, ecological spaces, you could see how they are eminently adaptable themselves. But I wonder about like their food, their what they eat, what eats them, the sort of the other kinds of species that they live with. How are those the sort of be, I don't know if you want to call them secondary impacts or just so we're saying possibly not a direct impact to a fish like a salmon, but what about all the connections it has with other?
Yeah, that's a great point. What are the effects on sort of the base of the food web and all the lower trophic levels that support all the higher trophic level organisms?
And I think one question we'll need to grapple with as we put the monitoring plan together is how far do we go toward trying to answer those questions versus just, you know, kind of being confident we're providing data that can help answer those questions. And I don't know that that's going to be a clean line. I also realized in hearing Chris and Sam introduce yourselves that I never did the same. So partly that's because I know Sharri and I know most people on the call, but just for the record, I'm Jake Kreitzer. I'm the executive director of NECAN. I'm also one of the NECAN Steering Committee co-chairs, and I also sit with Sharri on the Gulf of Maine Council. So apologies for that oversight. I also realized that I dove right into the questions without just a few logistics. The NECAN Steering Committee members, we have a separate notes document where we are capturing questions, but anyone, steering committee members or otherwise, can use the chat function here, and we'll keep an eye on that. Or, as Parker and Dwight are demonstrating rather effectively, use the raise hand function. Those are all ways to kind of let us know you have a question. So logistics aside, Dwight, I think I saw your hand first. I'm going to go to you and then you, Parker.
Great, and thank you so much, Sharri, for engaging with us. This is very insightful. And you know, speaking of the monitoring interest, it's really helpful for us to know what species are important to these communities, because that in many ways does shape the observing system. Because if we're trying to understand what the effects are on Atlantic salmon, then there's a certain domain of water masses in the Gulf of Maine that that require a characterization of the chemistry changes in tandem with our ongoing research. And in fact, NOAA has. I didn't introduce myself. Sorry, I'm Dwight Gledhill. I'm the acting director of NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program, and we fund a whole range of science on ocean acidification, partly observing, but also there's a very sizable portfolio of species response studies, and we have funded a number of studies looking at salmon. To date, a lot of that's happened in Alaska and Pacific salmon, so it's hard to make a direct connection. But in those cases, there are direct responses that have been detected in terms of effects on their maximum metabolic rate and growth. But we also don't know about their adaptive capacity, and maybe they can adapt to the change. There's a lot of unknown about it, right? So it's important that we get an observing system that helps describe sort of the current dynamics of the chemistry, but that has to happen in the context of this whole other portfolio of investments that we do on the species sensitivity. So it's very valuable to know that.
Well, and I have wondered about the fact that because salmon are in such dire straits, how easy it is, or how hard it is to be able to look at those relationships, given basically the impoverished ecology of of migratory fish. And
Well-
I am curious about if there are connections with, outside the Gulf of Maine, maybe up in like Newfoundland or where there are basically maybe more intact systems. If anyone's looking there.
There is a lot of academic institutions outside of the United States right now that are looking specifically at Atlantic salmon, and those include University of Bergen in Norway and St. Andrews in Scotland and British Columbia in Canada. So there is actually, there is actually quite an international interest beyond the U.S. in Atlantic salmon that probably has a wealth of information that we could gather.
And ocean acidification too, right?
Yeah, no, those are studies. They're actually looking at ocean acidification effects.
Okay.
Many of the institutions. So, so I do have a question for you, if I have a moment. So,
Before you go, Sharri, can I just ask you to stop sharing your screen so we can see more faces? I don't want to miss people raising hands or thank you. And Parker, I just want to check her hand went down or were you covered? Okay. All right. Keep going. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Just a quick question. You've communicated to us there's a generalized interest in the effects of a changing ocean on these species of interest. And like Jake was referring to, I'm sure we're getting inundated from a million different directions from people. We certainly don't want ocean acidification science coming in some additional pipe and becoming more distracting. So what I really want to know is what is the primary vehicle or vehicles by which you look to provide you information on how the changing ocean is affecting resources of interest to you?
Well, so as I say that we are part of the Gulf of Maine Council. I represent Houlton, Venno, Maliseet on the Gulf of Maine Council. I learn a lot there. I learned a lot during the regional planning body process. And I'm not sure how things are sort of getting crazier in terms of what I need to focus on. And frankly, we're looking to get a fisheries biologist. I mentioned I'm not one. We desperately need one. And so I'm hoping our capacity will increase to take on more of this kind of information if and when we can bring a fisheries biologist on board. And at that point, I think we'll just have we'll have a bigger ear. We'll be able to hear more and understand more and hopefully bring some understanding to the table of our what's going on here to the table as well. So I do try to participate in very high level bodies. That's where I'm best suited. And so I am on your listserv. I do, and I have seen presentations on ocean acidification before. So I do try to keep at least up to date and informed about new developments or lessons learned.
I think that's great. We want to be helpful to you and make sure that if there as wherever possible, I'm wearing my NOAA hat right now, wherever possible, as NOAA's got a million different avenues of information coming at you, we can consolidate those and leverage and nest ourselves on top of all those other streams of information. So it's helpful to kind of know where those streams are coming in. So that's all.
Well, can I say that we tried to get some money from you all to hire fisheries biologists, and that did not work. So if you've got an ear somewhere.
Wasn't my office, somebody else.
Hey, Sharri, for what it's worth, I am a fisheries biologist, yet I'm spending a lot of my time masquerading as an oceanographer. So I feel your pain, but I thought you did a pretty damn good job of articulating the life history and ecology and impacts on salmon. So you've picked up something along the way. I also just want to make a note, picking up where Dwight left off on these questions. I had similar questions about, I had made a note to myself when you were talking about the scale of the watershed and the impacts there. I mean, the question I said was, okay, so given everything you're trying to deal with in the watershed, are we barking up the wrong tree, right? Is any kind of ocean impact kind of too low of a priority? But then you follow that up with, but these things spend a lot of time in the ocean as well. And there's a lot going on out there. We need to understand it. So that sort of had me pivoting to whether it's kind of OA in isolation or OA with a, interacting with a range of relevant drivers. How do we sort of characterize ocean conditions in a salmon-centric way? I don't know that we want to answer that question here, but that's a question I have. The comment I was going to make on that was I just came back the week before last from meetings hosted by NECAN, which is our sister organization in the Pacific Northwest. And they're grappling with similar questions. Salmon are obviously a big deal out there. And I got the sense that despite that, they're not that much further ahead in sort of characterizing ocean impacts, and it's something they're trying to figure out. So NECAN, which like NECAN spends more time kind of offshore, is starting to work more. They've been working with tribal groups for a long time, but on a number of issues, some related to Dungeness crab and other kind of coastal ocean fisheries, but also on this question of how can ocean observing systems help us better understand, just the suitability of habitat in the ocean phase of salmon, and how can that then lead to assessments, predictions, and shaping recovery strategies. So we might want to just keep tabs, maybe even at some stage, I don't know, it might be worth a kind of joint meeting between ocean observing practitioners and perhaps tribal interests on both coasts who have this shared interest in anadromous fish and impacts during the oceanic phase. Okay, Parker's hand is back up again, so I'm going to go to him, and then I think it was Kumiko, and then Beth.
Thanks so much, Sharri. I've got a question about, I think some of your related work through the NECAS group, the Climate Adaptation Science Center. And it seems like there's an active project that you're a partner with around vulnerable wetland species and vulnerable habitats to climate change. And the reason I asked to learn more about that is clearly, as we're thinking about carbon in the coastal ocean, the role of conservation, restoration, and preservation is a really important one in the actual watershed scale of how we're working on these ecosystems. And yet, I don't think we've yet really articulated the interplay between an ocean acidification monitoring plan and all the coastal efforts to restore and conserve wetland habitats and other coastal habitats. And so if you're willing just to offer some of your views about how you've considered kind of a more holistic practice of studying vulnerability in these environments while also carrying out active restoration projects at the same time. So a scientific inquiry that is also community action and simultaneously.
Well, I'll give it a shot. So we have been thinking a long time about climate impacts because our waters are warming. It is something, that is we already see the impacts of in our system. We have a lot of smallmouth bass that are doing very well. The temperatures in the Madaxnicag and particularly the main stem where tribal lanes are located are through the roof. Thank heavens, fish are smart and they go find cold water. And we have cold water in the system, but we don't know where. We have general ideas of which systems are colder than others. So we are told by Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife that that's why our system is so healthy, because we have great tribs with lots of cold water inputs. And so despite the degradation of the main stem, we're still doing well, but we want to understand that more so that we can identify those areas that are that are contributing to that health, the health of the system, and protect those areas. And we're looking for ways to understand, to identify those areas. What would be lovely if we could look at the sort of understand the general characteristics and of those, where it's coming from, and then maybe project where they are. But we're also just looking at, are there ways where we can just map them? And so we've talked to USGS about, I mean, they have various ways of identifying cold water seeps. One fascinating one is that you can actually put monitors on fish and have them go upstream, and where they're going to go look for those cold water seeps, because that's where they'll be healthy, and it'll be a really fun way of identifying where the cold water seeps are. But that's sort of our next step of looking at our particular watershed and where we might protect the system, the value of the system through conservation, so whatever conservation practice we can establish. And wetlands are a mystery to me, honestly. We have I've never quite understood how they fit in. I mean, I know they're highly productive systems and important, but I've never quite understood where they fit in the migratory fish realm. A lot of people have said early on, yeah, those beavers, they keep out our trout and migratory fish, and we gotta do something about those beavers. And then there are we have an example of where a wetland actually somebody took apart a beaver dam in a large wetland system, and there was a big chunk of the low oxygen, low DO water that just we had some automated samplers out there, and then you could just see it flow through the system. This big chunk of water that just that the monitors identified as it flowed downstream. So that doesn't seem good, but it's a wetland, it's a beaver wetland, it's got to be good. So it's a bit of a mystery, but we think wetlands, certainly wetlands culturally, are extremely valuable. They have a lot of cultural plants that are of importance to us, and we see it. I know there are a lot of other values of wetlands when it comes to water storage and how they affect the hydrology of the system. So I hope this is answering your question, Parker. Okay. So that's go ahead. I am done. I'm done.
No. Sorry, Sharri. I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought I was going to hand it over to Kamiko, but please finish.
That is just one. So what we're going to do, we're looking at some funding to do a watershed assessment through NRCS, and we're hoping to figure out how to get a better handle on the hydrology of the system, including our wetlands and seeps and ephemeral streams and things like that.
And before I go to Kamiko, I just think a question not for you, but maybe for us as a steering committee, and as we put this plan together, is how we can draw then upon those kinds of wetland and upstream surveys to inform acidification trends and risks. I think that's something we should spend some time exploring. Okay, I'll stop editorializing. Kamiko.
Hi, my name is Kamiko Scott. I'm oceanographer in Canada, Bedford Institute of Oceanography, Fisheries Oceans Canada. And we are encouraged to co-develop program for climate monitoring with Indigenous community. And we are often actually criticized scientists don't spend enough time with or dialogue with the Indigenous community. We just sort of parachute in a community, we need to measure this and that and leave. But actually in Canada, data collected in Indigenous land or coastal area belong to them. and we need a permission to use them. So that includes the data management by Indigenous community too. But again, to work with Indigenous community, what do you think do's and don't for scientists?
So, I wish I had Suzanne Greenlaw here to talk to you about this. She is a tribal citizen of the Houlton Venno Maliseet Indians. She is a researcher with the University of Maine, and she is setting up this kind of way of doing science. She's exploring how to do it as a scientist, as a tribal citizen, with the University of Maine and with other federal agencies. So she spent some time with the National Park Service around basically a wetland plant that is sweetgrass, and how understanding the cultural connection to that sweetgrass and how sweetgrass is harvested, and the specialized knowledge of the harvester created a much more robust research structure. So that, because what the Park Service and is looking to do is open their sweetgrass patches up to harvest. And so they started out with a traditional kind of sampling scheme for where sweetgrass are and how picking would affect sweetgrass around the landscape. And that initial study basically says, oh, we can't let tribal citizens harvest sweetgrass because they'll overharvest. But if they had understood the harvesting methods of these tribal sweetgrass pickers, and where they focus their harvesting, rather than, they don't just sort of go out and just pick randomly sweetgrass. They focus on the productive, high quality patches. They have a method of harvesting which is low impact. And if they had studied that practice first in collaboration with those harvesters, they would, which they did eventually, they would find that no, in fact, the harvesting actually improved those patches rather than damaged them. So it's a fascinating story that Suzanne tells. She was a key part of that research. And so,
yeah, we often find that the sampling location, for example, the community knows better than we do which one should be. And that kind of traditional knowledge is very important. But it's difficult to, and like when we write papers, we are really encouraged to include them in publication.
Yeah, and I have to say, when it comes to straight environmental data, we share everything. We don't keep it to ourselves because we think it's important. Well, that's the part of our partnering. We need to, everybody needs to understand the situation for us to solve the problem. But when it comes to cultural uses and cultural knowledge, that's where it's really, really important to have an agreement about who owns that information and what is done with it. And that's something actually we're working out with USGS, or honestly, as we go through this cultural the wetland plants project with them. That's kind of a work in progress. Thank you for the question.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kamiko, because I think this is a really important topic, and it's got so many dimensions to it. There's kind of quantitative data generated by tribes that they might have ownership with. In my experience, like Sharri said, they're actually quite willing to share that. There's other types of knowledge, though, Indigenous knowledge, that some of which, again, I find in tribal communities are very open to share, want that to be understood, and some that's held a little bit more kind of privately and protectively even. Then there's things like, when we're talking about doing something like acidification monitoring, there's the why. Why are we doing it? And I know for some of the other communities I've spoken to, there are issues, those that are based closer to the coast, there are issues like submerged middens or burial grounds or, those kind of cultural heritage sites where it's sort of, okay, we want to make sure we're monitoring so we can evaluate and if necessary, protect those sites, but we don't want to reveal where they are. And so it's sort of, how we set up the monitoring system and how we communicate why we're doing it. So there's so many dimensions here. And I think it's a question we need to ask early. And this may be a factor as we put this plan together, if we do start to use some for instances from Indigenous communities that are, that sort of point to why different types of monitoring are needed. We'll need to make sure we're very careful about how we frame that. Okay. Beth, you've been really patient. So let's go to someone else. Anyone? No, Beth, please.
Thank you, Jake. And thank you, Sharri. I'm Beth Turner. I'm a retired oceanographer from NOAA. I'm working with NECAN on this particular workshop. So I'm thinking about your comments about the whole food web surrounding salmon and eagles as well. So are salmon the main food source for eagles as they go up the watershed? How big are salmon in the eagle diet? What are those linkages between salmon and eagles?
Yeah, that's where I think we've already broken the system. We don't know, because we've already broken the system. Eagles were gone for decades. Salmon have been in decline for hundreds of years. I do want, you wonder, things have adjusted, but what would the system look like if we had our full suite of, salmon and eagles, migratory fish and eagles? I speculate that they were very important because they were such a huge part of the seasonal food offerings. I expect that they gave a lot of animals a lot of food, including Indigenous folks back in the day. But yeah, how do we figure that out when you've got a broken system? I don't know.
And then another sort of related question is thinking about the whole watershed from the Gulf of Maine up to Houlton. And you were talking about the number of challenges that there are in allowing salmon to have that linkage, that historic linkage. So how many dams are there between where you are and the Gulf of Maine? Is it hundreds? Is it thousands? Is it 10?
One.
Okay.
One very large dam with like minimal fish passage.
Okay.
It's the Mactaquac Dam in Fredericton. We have actually been actively discussing that dam and fish passage, planned for that dam with Department of Fisheries and Oceans and our Maliseet First Nation counterparts for years now, for a long time. I just think that dam is the difference between survival of salmon in that system and no survival. They are so low that the numbers are incredibly low. You look at that big, huge watershed. There was I can't remember who he works for, but there's someone who manages for studies for, I think they manage fish passage on the systems through the dams in Maine. And he compared the habitat of the Outer Bay of Fundy salmon versus an Penobscot River salmon. And it's like 3 times the amount of habitat for Outer Bay of Fundy salmon versus the Penobscot River. So you can just imagine how much we've lost, how much biomass and ecology we have lost from that system. And the Mactaquac is a huge part of that. I mean, I haven't been able to see, and they haven't shared like data prior to the dam's construction, which is not that far back. It was in 1968 that dam was built, but the numbers since then have absolutely plummeted to next to nothing. And I don't see, there's a lot of conversation about how climate change has now become the controlling factor in salmon survival, but I'm not buying it. Not when we have a whole watershed to restore that could provide just a tremendous amount of habitat for salmon. So
are there surveys at that dam? Are fish lining up to try and get up the river and they can't because of that dam? Are there surveys below the dam to show the populations of salmon that are trying to get in?
Yes, well, yes, there's ever since they put that dam in, there's been work. But it's not work that has overcome the impacts of the dam. Studies, efforts at passing fish. There's a biodiversity hatchery above the dam where they try to keep salmon going. There's an effort with the Tobic First Nation, which is Maliseet First Nation, where the Tobic is one of the two big spawning habitat systems where salmon would, and it's way above. That actually has at least two other dams as well as the Macrocrack in between the Tobic. And that includes the Aroostook in Maine, and the Aroostook is the second biggest tributary that contributed spawning habitat for salmon. That's both those systems are north of us. So I think it's hard to. I don't think we can say we shouldn't try to restore. I think the systems are too connected. We can't say that, well, lack of survival in the marine environment means we can't restore it in the watersheds. Maybe we can't restore it in the marine system because we haven't restored it in the watersheds. I mean, I think there's a lot of justification, frankly, for why we're not trying to do a better job at improving fish passage. And in my mind, that means taking up that dam, but there's no decisions have not been made, and we're sort of running out of time.
Sharri, for what it's worth, I want to say I agree with you about 9,000%. I think a lot of dams have just been in place for so long, we kind of take them for granted or give up on trying to do anything about them. But in far more cases than not, it is easily the single biggest action you can take to restore a sea-run fish population, in my opinion, and I think in many others as well. It may also be worth noting of course, this webinar was originally meant to showcase at least a few Indigenous communities, and as it happened, we've got Sharri, and I want to, we want to be sure we're not putting her in the position of speaking for a rather diverse set of communities, and I don't think you are, and I don't think anyone is taking it that way. But in my view, if there is one theme that I see, maybe not in all, but certainly in a number of Indigenous communities across the Northeast and nationwide, in fact, it is this objective to restore sea-run fish populations. I think the Wampanoag have been active in that, and the small coastal streams of Cape Cod. Right here where I live in New Hampshire, the Abenaki are very vocal there. The Penobscot have been active, so this is, and the Passamaquoddy, of course, the Passamaquoddy are engaged in this. So this, it may not be the only one, and I don't know if it applies to every tribe, but it does seem to be one of the common themes across many Indigenous communities is, bringing back these fish. The species vary. The Wampanoag aren't doing a lot on salmon. There it's much more river herring, of course, but I think it's a lot of the same issues and the same, kind of cultural drivers behind it. So it seems I can't help but commenting. I'm going to try to stop that and make sure I let other people speak, including my esteemed co-chair who has been patiently waiting. So, Sam.
Oh, I just had a question going back to the eagles. I guess I was wondering what eagles you all are trying to encourage to nest, and what you're doing in order to what is encouraging to them to nest mean? Like, what activities are you all working on there? Yeah.
So we have DDT in our system. It is we live in a big potato growing area. It's cold up here. And so we still have significant levels of DDT and its breakdown products. They're significant enough to reduce the amount of fish you can actually eat safely in the Mid-Athabasca Cave. And it keeps me from engaging. I mean, nobody's ever called me on it, but it makes me think, you know, we do have eagles up here. They are extending into the area naturally, which tells me that DDT must not be too damaging at this point to their reproduction. But we also have a system that's been highly degraded, it's been fragmented and cut over, and you just don't have trees in our part of the watershed, which is downstream, and sort of in the lower part of the watershed, where in terms of the drainage, where the landscape is relatively low and the trees are not very big and at this point in time. So basically what we're doing, long story short, is to try to just improve the health of the watershed, including the forest. So we don't harvest our forests. We don't have much teeny-weeny land base, but we're letting the trees grow, and we are another part of the reason we have DDT in the system is because we have a lot of DDT laden sediment or farm soil washing into the system. So while it is a goal, it is not something that we're not putting up our artificial eagle nests. We are, just trying to restore the watershed and the watershed ecosystem. That's our general approach to eventually getting eagles to nest on trouble.
Thanks.
Sure, I just want to take a moment and see how you're holding up, because you're you're doing lone duty here and fielding questions. We're booked till 2:30, but if you need to move on, let us know. We can wrap up. I have other questions, but I can hold off on asking them. Or so. Good to keep.
I'm having fun.
Okay, good. All right. Well, does anyone else have a question before I turn to one or two of mine?
You have one
Parker.
more question, Jake.
Go for it, Parker.
Yeah, Sharri, some salmon habitat restoration is included for me.
I'm losing Parker.
Oh, I'll put it in.
While Parker's typing, Sharri, I said a moment ago we don't want to ask you to speak for other tribes, but I'd like to ask you to speak for other tribes. Do you, well, no, not speak for them, but I mean, just, I shared this insight about what I see as a common interest in sea-run fish restoration. I'm wondering if there's any other, and you don't need to attribute them to particular tribes, but do you see any other shared interests, particularly that have some kind of acidification or potential acidification linkage that might extend, maybe, again, maybe not across all, but at least multiple communities?
Yeah. Well, certainly the coastal tribes. I wish they could engage more, honestly. It's just not been possible for them to participate a lot in, so I know that the Passamaquoddy are interested in their coastal waters, in their bay, Passamaquoddy Bay. I know that to be true. I know they fish and gather in that system. and that it's an important part of their culture. I remember eating porpoise one year when I was down at a conference that they held, and it was terrible. It tasted like liver, which I really don't enjoy, but it tells me that they're still connected and to actively connected to harvesting and eating from the bay. And so I know they're looking to increase their involvement in that level. They just need the staff. They just need the capacity to do it. And certainly I know this to be true for the Mashpee. I'm sure you know that too, Jake. That and the Aquina. I mean, the coast, their ocean, what they how they use their coastal waters and the ocean for harvest is pretty significant. So so marine species beyond migratory fish, I know, are very important.
Yeah.
And if we were more connected, I mean, certainly Elvers right now is about we have members who go down to the coast and harvest for Elvers. I'm really curious about, I mean, our Elvers, because they're little tiny creatures. Do they have some extra vulnerability? And I know eels are in trouble. So that would be a curious. If right now it's a big economic boom as well as a subsistence boom, but I don't know how long that will last, and I don't know, where that whole fishery is going.
That's actually, I mean, that's a really important point, because I guess my assumption that I didn't even realize was an assumption was that when it comes to most sea run fish, and we're talking about acidification, it's potentially just migratory cues, or maybe kind of a secondary effect of acidification effects on lower levels of the food chain. But that by the time you get up to an adult salmon or even an adult river herring, pH within a certain range is probably not affecting them directly too much. Maybe that's wrong, but Elvers are a different story, because eels are doing it in the reverse. So you've got younger, smaller critters that maybe are having a more direct kind of biochemical interaction with their environment. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. Sandra, on this, or because I killed enough time to let Parker type his question, but Sandra, if it's on this topic, feel free to jump in. You're muted.
Let Parker go first.
Okay, very gracious.
Okay, so I could see his question.
You can see it. Okay, so
Yeah.
Everybody should be able to read Parker's question in the chat. I'll let you read it and then have at it, Sharri.
We do also, like the rest of the Willistic St. John, have an pretty alkaline system. We have calcareous bedrock, calcareous soils, which is why potatoes grow so well. So we don't need to improve our alkalinity up here in the Mid-Essex Cape. And so, but that practice of bringing clamshells into whatever system of interest there is in terms of buffering acidification from climate change is something that all the tribes in New England are talking about right now. So it would. I am very curious. I haven't heard. I've heard two things. I've heard that it hasn't helped that much in the down east rivers, but I've also heard that there are some successes. So I don't really know the status of that practice, and I'd like to learn more.
Sandra, and I don't know if you and Sharri know each other, so just if you don't mind introducing yourself.
No, I'm new to the group, and I thank you for letting me be here. I don't have any official affiliation with any of the groups involved, but I have been watching the ocean acidification issue through the lens, primarily with the lens of shellfish. and I come from the area around Cape Cod, so I've been watching it from a whole different angle than what has been discussed here. But I just want to make a comment, if I could, that I've been struck with the coupling of salmon and eagles. And as I was watching this and looking at the large map of the huge watershed of the Gulf of Maine, it also struck me of another coupling of right whales and copepods, and how these two types of couplings are both associated with ocean acidification. And one is with the freshwater input into the Gulf, and the other is the animals in the Gulf that are just using those resources. And I'm struck by what all of the work is going on, and what I'm coming away with is a hopeful signal that there is so much work going on, and I just hope that a lot of that work can be synthesized, and so that we can get a full picture of what is going on from the land to the sea. And I know how complicated this is and how complex, and I'm just grateful to all of you for doing your work, and hoping that all of the universities and groups on both sides of the border are working together to take a look at all of these interactions. And I just thank you. I'm an author who tries to put these issues into common language. So I'm grateful to just be here and listening to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining, Sandra, and thank you for that comment. I'd actually like to turn it into a question for Sharri, maybe for you, Sandra, or for anyone else. But how do we do that synthesis? You know, we're talking about something that's large scale and complex, and weaving acidification into a kind of broader suite of changes and drivers, and I don't know what that looks like exactly. I can imagine something maybe, but
I can imagine it too, and I have a vision of it, but I certainly don't know the execution of the vision.
what does the vision look like?
Almost a I don't even know how to explain it, but when you see a flow chart or a food web chart, you see all of the lines going in all different directions. If we could get that picture of the lines going in different directions and have each line so meaningful that it really does make sense, it might get the picture across to other people who aren't familiar with this, of these interrelationships and how interconnected everything is. And I don't know whether that's really possible or not, because it still requires so much research to even find the connections between so many things. We just don't know a lot. I mean, we're talking about the ocean, which is, as they keep calling it, the last frontier. There's still so much to learn, and we have we're doing so much, but each little step is a step, and it needs that step to go to that step to the next step and combine these, and that's really difficult. And there's not money enough to synthesize this. I don't know where that would be coming from, but I'm intrigued with the indigenous populations who have a much longer view than we tend to, and I'm glad, so glad that they are so involved in their part of the picture, and the sharing of that, I think, is just absolutely wonderful.
Sure, did you want to weigh in on this before I go to Beth?
A long time ago, someone from Big Ol' Lab called me and said they were starting up I can't remember how they sort of rivers to ocean, or just sort of a initiative or a program that made some of these connections, and sort of in an educational forum. People could, I think it was more educational than scientific, as a way to teach people about those connections. I mean, we have and sadly I couldn't engage. I don't know what happened to that initiative. I think it was an application for funding that and so and her thinking was the same as Sandra's. I mean, tribes in the Wabanaki tribes, they totally connect the watershed from headwaters to the coast to the oceans. And they're riverine. You know, we call the Houlton and Maliseet, like it's a riverine tribe, but the tribe, when it had the freedom to travel and hunt and fish without boundaries and fences and property rights and things like that, took full advantage of all that, of all those connections. And so it would be, I think, a nice project to take that culture and cultural, that this would certainly have to be a co-designed collective approach, but it's an illustration of those connections, and particularly with people with the indigenous cultures of riverine tribes. So.
Thanks, Sharri. Beth?
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. Those are really interesting and challenging comments. I don't think that we need to wait until we know everything about all those connections before we start thinking about how to depict them. I think that there is a lot of value in trying to draw some kind of graphic like that. And then that helps you see where we don't know enough to say anything about those arrows between the boxes, and then that can help direct where funding needs to go to learn about those connections. So, I don't know that we need to know everything before we start thinking about how they all connect.
Other questions or comments? See anything else in the chat? I'm checking online. I think we've covered most of the ones online. I have one more, and Sharri, I asked you this when you and I first spoke close to 3 years ago, not long after I came on board at Syracuse, and I took a lot of what you said to heart. But I think it'd be good revisiting the question, which is, I think this webinar reflects a clear interest in NECAN in engaging with tribal communities and understanding their needs and trying to meet those needs, perhaps bringing them on as partners, et cetera. I think an important question is always the how. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to share insights on going forward. And this can be going forward between, now and the development of the monitoring plan, because I think that is a pretty critical phase for NECAN, but even beyond, once we have a monitoring plan and we work to implement it, what do we do? What do we need to consider? How do we be good, respectful partners with Indigenous communities?
Well, certainly partnering with Indigenous communities means a lot of patience, a lot of relationship building, a lot of trying to go to where tribes are rather than bringing them in, to sort of sometimes that can work, but oftentimes it's better if you're going there. I do hope that this latest, we are extremely busy trying to staff up. Because there's a lot of funding flowing. It's possible, as I say, if we can get a fisheries biologist, we'll be able to engage more. So that is our practice, to try and go out and engage with folks like Syracuse or in NROC and the RPB and the Gulf of Maine Council and all that. But that's an unusual. We're unusual in that regard. For that's not saying that we're. It's just saying we have the opportunity. That's it. And so it's possible that this will be an opportune time to have that kind of engagement. Boehm is that we've got the wind power development going on. That is Boehm is looking to help support tribal engagement. There's funds at NROC to try to engage to fund tribal engagement. And I don't know how far that goes in terms of staffing up, but as I say, there's a lot of funding out there that may allow us the capacity to engage at this point. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but I think that because it seems to be really difficult to get staff these days. There may be like a nexus, there may be like a sweet spot coming around. But ultimately, what you heard from my counterparts is what we're dealing with right now. We are slammed.
Yep.
It's a lot of good stuff, but the best will and the best way may not get you the kind of collaboration that we'd all want, but can't achieve.
Just FYI, you're very consistent, because when I asked you that question 3 years ago, that was pretty much the same answer, and it makes sense. So we are at 2:25. So I mean, we know where to find you, Sharri, but if anybody wants to take advantage of our captive audience with Sharri, please get any final questions in. Okay, in that case, Emily, are we okay to wrap up?
Yeah. Yep. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, Sharri. Thank you everybody else for attending and for your questions. This was recorded. It'll be up on the NECAN website. And our next webinar is Thursday, September 7th from 1 to 2:30. So information on that will be sent out through the mailing list. It'll be up on our website. It'll be shared. So just again, thank you everybody for joining us today. And we'll see you again for the next one.